How do you pronounce your last name, Joey?
Redner.
So Joey Redner, welcome to the show. TBD Podcast. Appreciate you being here. You are the founder of Cigar City Brewing. So did you want to bring Tampa's culture to the spotlight? Like, why call it Cigar City Brewing?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was starting the brewery, one thing that always stood out to me growing up in Tampa is, a city this size, especially the time when I was getting the brewery going. Most cities this size had 5 to 10 breweries. We really had no breweries that were actually packaging beer to sell outside. We had brew pubs, but we didn't have any, manufacturing breweries in the city limits. And so when I set out to do that, I mean, obviously, growing up here, I'm very aware of Tampa's history and what I thought made it unique. And I thought, man, that's, obviously that's where you start. Is you kind of share, because even some people that live here, that have lived here for years, aren't really fully aware of some of the historical
Right.
Side of Tampa. So yeah, it just seemed like a no-brainer to me to build the, at least thematically build things around Tampa's history.
Yeah, 100%. And then today it's really, and I know you've sold Cigar City Brewing, and it's obviously evolved in those years. But now it is an instrumental part of Tampa's culture. I just got back from North Carolina. They have Cigar City up there. Like it's expanded in an incredible way. And oftentimes cities have these iconic things about them that are placed in beer, cigars, marketing materials, movies, culture, right? They get ingrained in American culture, and then they're added to, regionalism, and the vibe of an area has to do with its history. So it's dope that you kind of had that at the forefront in your mind when you started the brewery. That's a really cool thing, man. How did you get into beer at all? I mean, obviously you like drinking it at the start, but why'd you decide to make it?
Yeah, honestly, I got into beer to the level I did because I didn't like a lot of the beer I had access to. And again, young man just first start kind of going out and drinking beer. I just didn't like what I could readily buy.
Right.
And because I didn't like that, but everyone else seemed to be very excited about it, I just was always like, oh, I'll try something new. And then eventually I found out that I love beer. I just didn't like the most popular beer. And then once you find some things you like, and you can't always consistently get access to them, you just keep, I just kept researching, found out I could make beer, and I would track down beers at places that would specialize in carrying good beer, and it just grew out of that. And then eventually, I got to the point I was waiting and waiting for someone else to start a brewery. That I started asking myself internally a lot of questions of like, well, if no one's doing it, why are they not doing it? Is it too expensive?
Right. Yeah.
Are the margins not possible? Can you, why is it not happening? There must be a good reason. And in asking all those questions and answering them, I kind of built a business plan, and I was like, well, it does make financial sense. You can make money doing it. There's certainly challenges, but if you did it this way, then it would work. And so I just kind of built a business plan without trying to, and that's what it grew out.
Rolled with it. I mean, just went for it.
Honestly, I guess I got tired of waiting for someone else to do it.
Wow. Yeah. So what year was this when there wasn't any craft breweries?
So I first started having the thoughts around 2004. And then by 2007, I was incorporating and then building out through 2008. And we were pretty much done in 2008, but didn't actually start selling beer until right at the beginning of 2009.
That's a long time to get going in the beginning. Were you doing a lot of research, traveling, trying different breweries around different cities?
All of that. Like the idea to do it probably started first to kind of percolate in my head around 2004. And that's where I said I started to just be like, why is no one else doing this? I just I was getting really into beer. I was homebrewing. I was, buying lots of beer. And I was even on websites trading beer with people.
Wow.
Yeah, you could trade beer with people in different states and different countries. And they'd ship you a box of beer and you'd ship them a box of beer. And so you'd get exposure to other things that way. So I was getting really into it, but I still, I didn't really have the idea to start doing it until I started, actually what I did is I started working for another brewery, Dunedin Brewery out in Dunedin. And that really got me asking even more questions, because then I had access to sort of what they were doing, what their financials were. I had the idea, probably, like, really, I was like, I'm going to do this right around 2006, but I had the idea in my head before.
It's a long road from liking beer to actually making beer. Walk me through the first batch you made and what did it taste like?
The first batch I made wasn't great. I tried to make like a guava, kind of a guava wheat beer, and it well, I know that it got infected with something, and it made it tart, which later would have been a huge hit. But I wasn't trying to make a sour beer then. I was trying to make a clean guava wheat beer. But you just go back to the drawing board and you try again, I out of that kind of grew a lot of ideas. And what was funny is I liked the beer, but it wasn't what I was trying to make.
Right. Yeah.
There's so many ways that you can tweak and improve. Even, you can make really good beer at home.
That's how
with
the
very
best stuff
basic
is.
equipment.
That's how the best stuff is created, though, right? Like all of this experimentation.
Accidents too, yeah.
You're shooting
Happy
for this
accidents.
flavor, but it dog legs off into another flavor. Hey, that's a good idea.
Yep.
How much of that was there in the beginning? It sounds like you're just tasting a million beers and trying these different recipes.
Yeah, a lot of, a lot, when I was thinking about the brewery, I mean, a lot of it was definitely just recreate classic recipes that already existed. So I wasn't trying to create, everything new that had never existed before. An IPA within a range is an IPA, and I wasn't trying to reinvent that. I was very cognizant and very much trying to incorporate things that I thought were very Tampa and Floridian, hence guava.
Love that. Yeah.
One of the early beers we did, this is an idea I got from another home brewer. He was a beer sales rep, and he would go down into Ybor, and he would, when they were throwing away the cigar boxes, he would take the inserts and he would, like, kind of dry hop, was it's called. He would basically add it to the finished beer, and I'd had that beer and I was like, Mike, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, I really liked it, and I just thought it was so quintessentially Tampa. You could smell, what it smells like when you walk into a cigar shop and you smell that wood, that cedrela wood. It was just something that screamed Tampa to me. So those were things I was very conscious of. But on the more commercial side, like I said, a pale ale within the range of what they can be is a pale ale, and you don't, you can add things to it, but you still need that base underlying beer to still be a good drinkable beer.
I feel like that line has been blurred, and maybe it's kind of back to the basics, but how many different types of beer are there now? Like I was in Asheville at Highland Brewery, 40 acres of just this awesome mixed use kind of brewery centralized area with food trucks and all that sort of stuff. They must have had a ton of different types of beer. And whether it's like a Pilsner or an IPA or it has a specific moniker within that, the range is pretty wild. So starting out like back in '04, '06, like there was probably a lot less variety back then to work with.
Well, there was, I think, you still had breweries at the time that were doing, in a purely definitional stylistic, way, that there's still quite a lot of beers, but even within that, you can take a beer and you can tweak it, sort of within that style, by adding fruit to it or wood aging it. It's not really another style. It's just sort of a
Right.
treatment of an existing beer. Then there were definitely breweries that were doing, if you just look at German beers and you walk through all the different types of lagers, I mean, there's dozens.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's before you get into ales and Belgian styles, and just there's so many different styles of beer, and there's so many different ways to tweak those styles. So you can take something that is an existing style and tweak it by adding fruit, coffee, wood. There's just so many different ways that you can play with beers, and it really infinite. There's infinite possible combinations.
It's been around for so long too, thousands of years. I
Yeah.
mean, men that marched on the battlefield used to bring beer with them.
So there's a theory that the whole reason that we settled down and started growing crops was so that we would have steady access to barley, so that we could make beer. It's not an out there theory. There are lots of people that think, like, yeah, there's some truth to that. And it's probably one of the oldest fermented beverages. It kind of is probably honey, mead is probably the oldest, but barley is like right behind that, before grapes, so before wine.
How do you exactly make it? I mean, obviously you can add a bunch of different fruit, like you said, but what's the basics of a beer?
Fundamentally, you're taking barley, which is your sugar source, and it needs to be called what's malted. I mean, it starts to germinate. And so it makes the sugars accessible. And then you're heating that up and extracting the sugars. And then to that, you're going to introduce yeast, which is going to eat those sugars and convert them into, CO2 and ethanol alcohol, which
Mm.
is why beer has carbonation and alcohol. It's literally just converting those sugars into what we drink.
And is that an ale? Like, what is that
So it can
called?
be an ale or a lager. The only real difference is sort of, well, they call well, there's temperature. So lager yeast like colder temperatures, but it's also where the yeast flocculates or where it does its work. Um, Ales typically are going to have a little bit more fruity esters, and they're going to ferment warmer and typically more top fermenting, whereas lagers are going to be they're going to ferment a little bit cooler,
Mm.
and they tend to be cleaner and crisper in flavor, less fruity, but tend to be less fruity than an ale will be.
Is it a specific type of yeast that
It is.
makes, because in cheese, right, the specific type of
It
bacteria,
is.
like the strain, dictates the
And there's
flavor.
so many. It's such a science now. I mean, there's yeast that have been hybridized to do very specific things. There's yeast that are hybridized to, ferment at warmer temperatures but still give lager-like qualities. There's, anything that develops over time that they're going to science the heck out of it, and they've done
Right.
that with yeast. There's such a variety of yeast strains that you can use, and that, and there's still, if you want to open a brewery in Florida, but ferment with very typical like 1700s profile, Thames Valley yeast, you can do that. That yeast exists.
Wow.
You order it and bring it in, and you can get those profiles that they've recreated from these classic yeast strains that have been around forever.
Wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. I mean, basically drink the same beer, same flavor profile, all that. What did it look like in the beginning? Like science, you were talking about it looks like science. It is science, right? Like you go to a
Yeah.
brewery and there's these components and barrels and all these hoses. It's kind of wild to look at. For you in the very beginning, were you just in like a spare bedroom doing this? How were you creating your
Yeah,
beer?
we actually had a spare bathroom, and I would actually put the carboys, it's big glass, those 5 gallon glass containers. A lot of people like say pennies in them, but you just put an airlock on the top, and it's a fermenter. And I would put them in the bathtub, in the spare bathroom. My wife thought that was
Yeah.
crazy.
So what's her conversation with you at this time? Was this like a funny idea that she just let you play with?
Yeah, she just
Basically?
my wife Jennifer, she's always been very accommodating of my silliness.
What does Jennifer think now that, or at the time when you guys were getting a lot of business and some notoriety? Was she like, wow?
Yeah, I think she was always very supportive, and when it was a hobby, when beer was just a hobby, to when it became a business. So we had our first children. So I had twins. It was our first children in November of 2007. I had just incorporated the business in October of 2007. So we had literally new business and new kids at the same time. So as busy as I was, she was just as busy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn, those early days grinding.
Yeah.
When did you know you could take it out of the bathtub to an actual facility?
Really, that came slowly, but it's like I said, I just kept asking these questions of why are people not doing this? I mean, we had breweries in the area, but they tended to be brew pubs, and some of it was laws and people not fully exploiting some of the exceptions in the laws, because in beer, it's a very different industry. It's so much more regulated than most industries. If I open a deli and I want to sell a ham sandwich, I can sell a ham sandwich to anyone I want. Well, with beer, you'd have to you have what's called the 3-tier system, which is a relic of post-prohibition legislation. And in some states, if you make a beer, you can just go sell it to a bar. But in Florida, you can't. You have to sell it to a distributor who then sells it to the bar. And the idea of that was to protect against what they called tied house evils, meaning, in the past, a lot of breweries would effectively just open their own bars, and it would stifle competition because they could undercut everyone else's pricing. I think I think that is a legacy of a past that hasn't existed even in my lifetime, much less now.
Yeah,
But
that sounds like some bootleg type shit.
yeah.
Like the guy in the back cooking up, with the distillery, serving
Yeah,
it to the
and so
local
and
bar.
there's states where they are self distribution, and many of those states, those breweries come here and sell beer, but they're enjoying those really good margins back home where they can directly self distribute. Florida breweries have always been at a disadvantage in that regard, I think, to out-of-state breweries
Yeah.
that can do that. Plus, if you're a smaller brewery, it may not make sense for a distributor to even bother dealing with you. You just don't have enough accounts for them to care. And so the lack of self-distribution, I think, kind of hindered breweries' development. But we can sell in a tasting room to go direct to an end consumer, and that does provide a robust profit center because it is very capital intensive to start a brewery. Stainless steel has never been cheap. It's honestly right now it's about as cheap as it's ever been, but it's still an expensive endeavor to open a
Yeah.
brewery. And so the laws, I I don't think a lot of people in the past, so pre 2000 and say 10, were aware that you could do that you could sell directly. It became more well known, obviously, and people opened a ton of breweries and benefited from that law. But I don't think people really understood. And when I started the brewery, like I knew that I was going to have to do that. I was going to have an on premise to go sales to make it viable. And it just so happened that it was, it far exceeded even what
Yeah.
and I was a cheerleader for craft beer, and I really carried the torch high. But I knew it was an underserved market, but I very much underestimated how underserved it was.
Well, I'm trying to think, like back then, there really wasn't a lot of breweries in town, if at all. And if they were, like you said, it was a small little restaurant serving up its own
Yeah,
stuff.
there's probably 3 times more breweries just in Tampa than there was in the whole state when I opened.
That's crazy.
You had Tampa Bay Brewing Company, Hops was still around then, and then Dunedin Brewery, and then Saint Somewhere Brewing out in Tarpon Spring had just opened right before I did. I mean, that was pretty much it. There wasn't a lot else.
And now you've got a list,
I
a
mean,
mile long.
just in Tampa, there's probably 3 times as many breweries just in Tampa than there was in the entire state of Florida.
That's wild. That's so crazy. So, who tried your bathtub beer? Was the wife drinking it?
Yeah,
She said it was pretty good.
friends, just anyone I could I could sucker into giving it a try.
And then where was that first jump? Did you like lease a warehouse or something?
Yeah, so well when I had the idea to do it, my dad actually had some space that he had never leased. It was just blank warehouse space, and it had never been leased in 6-7 years he'd owned the building. But I liked the location. It's where Cigar City Brewing is today. I did look at other places. I even considered like Ybor because people hear Cigar City and they assume it's in Ybor.
Right.
But I was using it obviously just as a reference to the name of Tampa. So I did look at other places, but the fact that he had never leased it before, he was willing to let me have it very cheap. So I ultimately went there, and I really liked the location. I liked we were close to the airport. It was very centrally located,
Right.
not far from the Buck Stadium. So it ended up being a really good location, and that neighborhood has really grown up a lot. There's a lot more residential than there used to be. It's more dense than it was. And this was even before International Mall. I think it was just getting started to get completed or a little bit before then. So,
Yeah. And the city finally paved Spruce Street.
Yeah.
That road was so bad for so long. It's nice to see it's all shiny now. So tell people who your father is, right? Your father is a kind of a legendary Tampa entertainment guy.
Yeah. So my father's Joe Redner, and he started Mons Venus, but has been involved with many other businesses in town. But he's known for obviously the Mons and Tango before that. And it's as growing up in Tampa, and it's different for me obviously because I grew up around it. But
Right.
but I get why he's a notable character. Even if I divorce myself from the fact that he's my dad, I get it.
Well, people just when they think of Tampa, there's a couple things that come to mind, right? The cigars, and obviously Cigar City Brewing is a part of that. You can find it nationally, and Mons Venus was always a part of that equation too. It was like people want to go to Burns and they want to go to Mons Venus when they visit Tampa. That was it. I mean, in the '90s when I was a little kid, my dad would even talk about stuff like that. Not that he would frequent those establishments, but they were iconic to our city, right? When you were little, did you want to, besides beer, right? Did you want to create something for Tampa that was kind of Tampa branded?
No, when I was little, I'd never thought of it that way. And honestly, again, with the brewery, I never thought like, hey, I'm going to be the guy to start the brewery. I really did think like I thought. I know a lot about beer, and when that guy opens the brewery or woman opens the brewery, I can work for them because I know a lot about beer and I know a lot about Tampa, and I'd be a great employee for them. That's really more where my head was, and it was the fact that that no one was doing it and no one was doing it, and I felt like the window was getting smaller and smaller. So that's what pushed me to do it. But no, I definitely didn't set out to, you know, like consciously to do that. That said, once I made up my mind to start the brewery, it was a no-brainer to me that I would wear Tampa on my sleeve,
Right.
as far as how I position the brewery.
Well, we've got an awesome culture and an awesome brand to sell to the market. I really think that a lot of other Florida cities, obviously I'm a little biased, but you know, it's like Orlando kind of has the Disney World thing and Miami has the nightlife, but Tampa has such a deep, deep history that goes back so much further than a lot of these other places in Florida. And I think that is what's special about our city.
Yeah, it does. I get in a lot of I like a nice internet debate, and I've gotten a lot of Cuban sandwich debates, and it's all invariably it's always someone from Miami who's like, oh, you guys don't know what you're doing. We make the best Cuban sandwiches, and I'm like, you just started making them an hour ago.
Exactly.
As far as the history of Tampa goes, you know.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that was an immigrant sandwich, right? That's the pork, the Spanish pork, the Cuban bread, the Italian salami, the German mustard, the Swiss cheese, the German
melting pot
cheese,
sandwich.
right? That's what it was. It was for those cigar workers and those workers in Ybor to take on their commute. They could get something to go and head out for the day. That's such an amazing story rather than, oh, Cuban sandwich. A lot of Cubans live in Miami. That must have been where it was created.
And not to knock their sandwich, it's a tasty sandwich, but it's not a Cuban sandwich in the way that I've come to know it, and it's certainly chronologically it's the later sandwich.
You're right.
You know,
100%.
and again, they think, oh well, it was from Cuba, but that wasn't the Cuban sandwich. That was the mixed dough. It's called a Cuban sandwich because the Cuban immigrants in Tampa were the ones eating it. It's just like you don't call Chinese food in China. You call it food.
Exactly.
It's called a Cuban sandwich because you had people that were non-Cubans seeing that the Cubans ate it. And that's why it's called a Cuban sandwich.
Tampa has so much little food items that I think could be explored even further.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like even the deviled crab, right?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that are just you don't realize are unique to here. What's the pizza that they do at Alessi? The
Scacciata.
Yeah, that you can't find that pizza anywhere else in the country.
It is absolutely fantastic. Can you pull up Scacciata, Tyler? Just type Alessi pizza and it'll pull up.
Yeah, I never loved the pizza, but it was so big. Like every birthday party I went to from the time I was like 3, and like it was at every birthday party.
It was an absolute staple. Every birthday party.
I never
game.
knew that didn't exist anywhere else. You cannot find that anywhere else in the country.
There it is right there. It is the best way to describe it for listeners that haven't had it is it's almost like those Hawaiian rolls, like that texture of soft, sweet bread with a marinara sweet sauce on top with a light little cheese, and it is so good.
The closest thing I found, there's in some places they have something called a tomato pie. It's not the same, but that's the closest analogy to it.
Cuban pizza, hit that on the top right. Is that's what people in Miami probably call it, the Cuban pizza?
Probably. Yeah.
Alessi, another iconic Tampa staple. Absolutely amazing. It'd kind of be interesting to do. Did you so let's talk about kind of when Cigar City was getting bigger or at least when you moved out from the bathtub to the warehouse, you made that dedication to kind of growing and producing more beer and then distributing beer. What was the first batch like at Spruce Street? How did it go?
So the first batch of beer was it was Maduro Brown Ale, which is still a staple beer that we do. The brew went well. We had a big issue. So when we had originally gone down to construction services, got our electrical improved, we installed electric as approved on the plans, and we had our power on, and then they came out to do final inspection and they said, well, they shouldn't have been approved. And my first reply was, how am I supposed to know that? Your boss approved them.
Yeah.
And they literally fought for 2 months. So we brewed in January, and this was 2009. Probably no one remembers, but we had a weird cold snap. Like it stayed cold for a long time because even in January, it's not reliably cold in Tampa. But we just had this nice cold snap. So the beer sat and basically naturally filtered because everything sort of just fell out over 2 months because we had no power for 2 months.
Oh, shit.
I had laid out all this money. I'm ready to brew beer. I'm ready to actually have some money come in. I'm ready to sell this beer, and I can't get it out because I can't package anything because I don't have power. And so they argued over it for 2 months, the inspector and his boss, and basically then just came back 2 months later and said, okay, it's fine. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, man, I wish you could have figured that out in 2 weeks or 2 hours.
Man, I wish I could say it seems like things have changed in that regard, but I've heard some horror stories lately about people trying to open businesses in Tampa and having struggles with that sort of stuff.
I think it's a scale thing. I think if you're bigger, you just sort of build in private inspectors and all that, which not everyone has access to. And I think you have more savvy about what can go wrong and you plan around it. But I've done a lot of small things like this, and currently I'm doing a build out for another brewery called Late Start in the Encore development, and we've had a lot of issues where it's like, if we'd had a bigger team and maybe if I had 20 of these under my belt, I'd be able to see them. But it's like every time there's something I just could not have foreseen.
That's the perfect answer from an entrepreneur, right? How do I solve the problem that I don't control? But at the same time, dude, the city should figure out a way to let smaller entrepreneurs have it a little easier.
Yeah.
We don't want to have this roadblock and say only the big businesses that can afford it can get a permit.
And nobody wants to build anything unsafe. That's a bad business plan, right? I don't want my electric to be wonky and then the building burns down. Like what?
No.
How's that a win for me? So I don't, and again, like in my case, 2 months they waited to tell me to leave it as it was. Come on, if that's going to be the decision, you need to make that decision faster. Especially, I've laid out all this money to start a new business in an industry that, as I said before, no one was doing it. Now look how many we have. But I was one of the first to build the kind of brewery that I was building, and run into that. 2 months is a long time to be without income after you've planned everything.
It could have killed you.
It could have.
It could have killed you. And then we wouldn't have Cigar City Brewing. Yeah. The city needs to take note of that sort of stuff.
That said, though, that batch of beer was amazing because we, obviously it's not commercially viable to take, 2.5 months to make a beer, but that batch of beer was amazing.
So because it sat long.
It sat so long that we didn't have to filter it at all. So when you make a beer, there's still yeast and stuff in suspension, and you have to filter that out to get it where it needs to be. But if you have the time, like the city so graciously afforded me, you can just let everything sort of drop out, and so that you basically rack from above where all that stuff is, and you're just pulling out the really good beer. Ooh. It was that batch was perfect.
Well, why?
But again, you can't wait 2.5 months to make a brown ale.
No, but at scale, you probably could, right?
Not really.
No.
So depending on the beer, a really fast turn time's maybe 10 days, and then if you get into IPAs, it can be 21 days. But you want to be between 10 and 17 days, worst case scenario. If you're taking 2 months, if you're taking 2 months, you have to look at a fermenter. There you go, a fermenter. You can almost have to look at it as like a rental property.
Okay.
But it's like a one-time thing. So it'd be like if normally you're renting it out for 10 days and then you flip it, but the same person pays the same amount of money whether they get 10 days or 30 days.
Right.
You want to flip it as much as you can.
Yeah, that wouldn't be viable. Interesting. So it was fantastic. Did that give you a lot of confidence in the beginning?
It did. Our head brewer Wayne Wombles, he'd never been the head brewer at that scale. He'd had some brewing jobs where he was the head brewer, but it was much smaller. I think it also gave him a lot of confidence because he's a brilliant recipe creator, and it gave him the sort of push that he needed to know that he really could do this too. Because I was a home brewer, but brewing at scale is just it's a different job, and even really good home brewers will struggle to scale up and recreate recipes consistently until they've got some time under their belt.
I would imagine it's a completely different ball game. What did the team look like in the beginning?
It was me and Wayne.
It
was two of us. Effectively, it very quickly expanded because fortunately we got a lot of traction right away. But for the first year, it was 2 guys.
That's insane. Just y'all two getting beer going. So in that portion of your business, were you just making beer, trying what worked? Were you selling any of it at that point?
Yeah. So we were actually in the beginning only selling into distribution. So just draft and just into distribution. We hadn't even gotten the tasting room up and running until probably a couple months after that first batch of beer.
That sounds difficult, right? Because I'm sure there's a sales process, right? You go to the distributor. Are they testing the beer? Are they trying the beer?
So typically, yes, you'll give them beer to sample. We were a relatively new brewery. I had some relationships. It was J.J. Taylor who distributed us, which kind of it gave them the confidence that we would make decent beer, because obviously they, the only thing they had to try was homebrewed, because we did a lot of homebrewing, so 15-gallon batches. So they had tried many of those beers, but it's still not 15 barrels, it's 15 gallons.
Right. The consistency and the quality of
Exactly.
scale. That's a whole different ball game, like I said. So at what point did you really feel like, hey, we're rocking and rolling, and you started scaling, hiring employees?
I knew when we were doing the homebrew test batches. So Wayne had a lot of his own ideas that we incorporated. I had ideas that I wanted him to try and that he incorporated. I knew when we were homebrewing that we were onto something. I knew we were going to be able to make amazing beer.
And that Maduro beer, that was the first.
That was the first batch we brewed, and then High Lie was the second.
High Lie.
Yeah.
High Lie is your flagship now, right? That's the one I see the most just as a customer. I see that thing everywhere.
Far and away, that is, it's probably, honestly, I'm not even sure now. I know it got as high as like 65% of what we brewed. Yeah, it was High Lie when I was still actively running it. It could be higher now.
That is amazing. And so talk about the origin of that. Did you create that yourself?
So High Lie was Wayne's recipe, my name. Obviously, I grew up here, and I always thought High Lie was, I just thought High Lie, it was such an extreme, intense sport, and I thought it was a great name for an IPA, which is a more intense flavor experience. And it was something that quintessentially I thought I associated with Tampa. I used to go to the Fronton that was out there where it's the Home Depot now off of Gandy. So, to me, it was, I had the name for it before we ever brewed the beer.
High Lie is a wild sport. Pull up a Google image of High Lie too. I believe it has Native American origins.
No, it's from the Basque region of Spain.
Is it? Okay.
It is, yeah. It's from the Basque region of Spain.
Why did I think Native American?
That is
lacrosse.
Yeah.
Lacrosse. Yeah, High Lie is wild, man. They're shooting these balls at like 300 miles an hour. Isn't it kind of like racquetball in a way?
Yeah, it's probably closer to handball if you ever played handball.
Yes,
but it's the game with the fastest moving ball in all the sports. So that ball can get going up to 185 miles an hour.
That is insane.
That is insane.
Gosh, and they've got these long things they attach to their arm. Yeah, look at that. So they can launch that thing 180 miles an hour.
Yeah, it's a cesta, I believe is what that's called, and then the ball obviously would be pelota.
That's amazing. High Lie. And it's probably something people look at, when they're ordering a beer, and Jai a lot, that's probably hard to pronounce. But once you know what it is and the history behind it, that's a cool deal there. I love that name.
My favorite High Lie pronunciation, because it doesn't make any sense, but I've heard it multiple times, is Jolly Ollie. I'm like, how are you getting Jolly Ollie out of that?
Jolly Ollie. You should do like a Christmas version of High Lie. The Jolly Ollie. That'd be great. So you guys both created the beer. You came up with the name. Your brewer came up with the actual recipe. Did you first taste it and go, okay, we're on to something here?
Yeah, so he piloted it several times, but he had a pretty good idea where he wanted to be, where he wanted it to sit. And High Lie, if you know IPAs, where the cutoff for a double IPA is anything above 7.5%. High Lie is 7.5%. So it's right at that line. And if you've had the beer, it is a hefty beer. It's not, it was never my favorite beer. I like IPAs, but I'm not a huge IPA guy. I tend to like maltier beers. I love that High Low right there.
Now, what's High Low?
High Low is it's based off High Lie, so it's got a similar hop profile, but much lower ABV, much lower body. High Lie's got a pretty hefty mouthfeel, and then Guayabera is probably my favorite of the hoppier beers we do. It's a pale ale, primarily hopped to Citra.
Ooh,
I love that beer.
I got to try that one. I am not an IPA guy at all. I will say High Lie has soft, probably isn't the word you'd use, but it has I would say a more mild flavor that's tangible for a guy like me that doesn't like IPA. Like I can kind of get it down.
I'll be honest, obviously I'm very grateful to High Lie because helped build the but I never understood how someone could sit down and drink 4, 5, 6 of those.
Dude, you drink 3 or 4 or even 2 and you get a little loopy. You stand up from the bar and you're like, damn.
Maduro was always my favorite, but Guayabera is one I like a lot.
You still have Maduro and High Lie, the 2 OGs. What are some of the newer beers at that time that you were creating that became popular?
White Oak IPA. So it was just High Lie that we aged on, just American White Oak. And I actually really like that beer. I think somewhere I didn't... the reason I couldn't drink so many High Lies is, the ABV, but also just that higher level hop punch to me, the white oak kind of moderated a little bit. It kind of gave it a rounder, softer kind of mouthfeel and flavor. So I really love the white oak a lot. I love the Humidor IPA, which is again the IPA aged on the Spanish cedar, which they make cigar boxes out of. That was one of my favorites. That was one of I believe that was the first Great American Beer Festival award that we won was for that beer.
What was the name of it one more time?
It's called Humidor IPA. So it's
Humidor.
So it's basically High Lie aged on the technical name for the wood is Cedrela, but its trade name is Spanish cedar. It's what they make cigar boxes out of.
And when you say aged on, do you just
finish the beer, and then we actually originally we would just get chunks of the wood from Rome Lumber Yard over on Rome, but eventually we started having this specialty manufacturer kind of mill these spirals so you get more surface area contract. So they look like long corkscrews made out of the wood. And you would put those into the in the fermenter and then move the beer on top of it, and you just let it age, and it picks up that flavor.
Wow! And it's the specific type of wood, or is it? It's not from cigar.
So it's actually not. So it was called Spanish cedar, but it's actually not a cedar. It's a type of mahogany, but it is the type of wood that they use to make cigar boxes out of.
Wow! It's that kind of dark, rich.
Yeah,
wood.
and I think it naturally had sort of antimicrobial and pest insect properties because it was such a pungent wood. And so I think the reason they used it back in the day to age tobacco on was because it helped keep off some of that stuff.
And
it just worked so well in the beer. And I'm pretty sure we won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival for that beer, and I'm pretty sure that's what put us on the map. So obviously people in Tampa were aware of us, but that really kind of gave us some national notoriety when we won gold. And the wood age category is kind of a showy category at the Great American Beer Festival. If you're not familiar with GABF, it's like the Super Bowl of beer, contests.
Right.
If you win a medal there, you've won it about as high as you can. And so we won a gold medal for that. And that really kind of got us a lot of outside notoriety.
Is that a big part of how you grew? Was doing these different festivals and beer trading? I'd imagine a big part of your scale is getting people to try the beer. Period.
Yeah, it was. And honestly, in the beginning days, I just anytime anyone said, "Hey, do you want to come give us free beer at our event?" I was like, "Yes." And I just was, I was a road warrior just in the Tampa Bay area. You had an event, I would come and bring beer and pour it for free.
That's awesome, right? But you got to do that in the beginning. Did you have competition pop up during that time that you felt like, damn, I wish I'd started a little earlier? Because like you said, in the beginning, there weren't any. Somewhere along the way, there was a lot of craft breweries that popped up.
Yeah, I think I started at a really good time. I think the time that I did, if I had started a little earlier, it might have been a slight advantage. But I still was very much just a beer fan. So when new breweries started popping up, I was as excited as I would have been back then. Because I always wanted to see more breweries. I probably was a little bit too willing to help people get it. I gave free coaching to probably 24 breweries in the state.
So you didn't even really have that competition aspect of your mentality.
Yeah,
you were like, hey, the more the better.
I mean, obviously, I knew that it was going to be competition, but I didn't see it as negative competition. I saw it as growing craft beer awareness in general. And I figured if they educate other people about craft beer, I feel like we're making good stuff over here, so they'll get around to us too.
That makes sense. I mean, it also was a popular thing at that time. In the late 2000s, the craft brewery was very up and coming, and a lot of people hadn't tried craft beer because their community just didn't have it.
Yeah.
I mean, people just had all the regular national beers that were around forever. And then craft beer came on the scene, and I think a lot of people were interested because it was this new form of alcohol, much like how seltzer has really exploded in the last maybe 8 years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So have you guys done a seltzer?
Let's see, Cigar City, I believe, has. I don't think they continue to do it anymore. I'm trying to think. So I've invested in a lot of other breweries. I'm trying to run through my head of who else has done it. A lot of the bigger breweries have dabbled in it, but it's a tough category too because it's also there's a lot of churn. It's like, hey, it's cool this week and next week it's not, and you can't really, you build all these structures and get them in place to sell something, and then next week sales go down 30%. It's a hard business to stay in.
Yeah. How did it go with, was there a defining moment that really was a catapult for you guys? I mean, was winning that award that moment?
You know, it was definitely one of them. I think really, getting into Publix was a big one, which that we didn't even have to try. That was just people that were fans of the beer going to Publix's and asking for it. And I didn't, I was so naive about sort of selling into chain accounts, which is a whole different ballgame from selling to independent mom and pop bars. That when we walked in there to do the Publix pitch, we were already in. It was really just a formality, and I did not know until many years later how unusual that is.
Wow. So
Getting into Publix just put it put us into place, put us into Publixes along the beach. And so then tourists are seeing us that they don't have to go drive to come visit us or happen to be in a bar in Tampa. We're starting to hit people that just never would stumble across us.
that sounds like the real catapult.
It really was
Publix.
For charging the growth of the brewery. It definitely was.
So they actually approached you, it sounds like.
Yeah, so they approached our distributor, and our distributor said, "Hey, we have a chance to get into Publix."
Hey, we keep hearing about Cigar City.
Yeah, but I halfway through that meeting, I realized, no, we're already in. We're already in.
Really? You could just feel the
I knew.
vibe, like they just wanted you guys
Yeah,
to.
yeah, I already knew we were in, and it was just because they kept getting people asking about, carrying the beer.
That's amazing. So those customers that were looking for it at that time, where could you get Cigar City beer?
So we were, places like Total Wine, ABC, but we weren't in any real way in any grocery. We might have been in like your independent ones like Rolling Oats, but we were not really in any grocery. And so it was definitely more independent, non-chain places that you could find us.
Wow, that's really neat. And so was there a significant change immediately once you were in Publix?
Yeah, yeah, just
Really?
trying to keep up. Yeah,
Holy
just trying
shit.
to make enough beer to keep it going. We were perpetually, I mean, for a good 5 years, shorting what the distributor was ordering.
Wow. So that's kind of how it works. Publix says to the distributor, "Hey, we're looking for 10,000 cans." Then the distributor goes to you and says, "Hey, this is what
This is
we need."
what the order be, yeah, and this is what we're going to need next week to to keep it in. We were constantly chasing that, and again, you can't just turn a switch. When you have to upgrade and get a bigger brew house and get bigger tanks, that takes time. So and we were that's from about that time till up until 16 when I sold, we were constantly trying to keep up with demand. We
Wow.
never fully hit it.
So that was kind of an oh shit moment with Publix where you went, "Okay, we got to really dial in and,
Yep.
and brew a lot more beer."
And it was a pivotal moment too. And it was a thing too. You don't, it's not like there's a line that you're walking across as an entrepreneur that says, once you cross this line, everything changes. You don't know. I did not see it. But I went from being the kind of brewery that I thought I was opening to a completely different type of brewery that I had no idea what it was going to be like.
Did it change in a almost negative way where it went from you're brewing in your own house in your bathtub, you're having a lot of fun, you're trying a lot of beer, but then all of a sudden a few years later it's almost like corporate-y, and then you're doing business deals and
Yeah.
you're talking with these executives? Like, was that kind of a shift that maybe you weren't expecting or didn't even like?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And I did find too, like, post the transaction, I'm invested in a lot of little breweries, and they're run by other people, so I don't have to personally do everything. I can just be a mentor. I can offer guidance. I can sort of help troubleshoot things if it's something that I've experienced in the past, and I like that. So Cigar City Cider and Mead, which is in Ybor on 15th between 7th and 8th, that wasn't part of the transaction. So I still can be very involved with that. It's at a much slower pace, and I can enjoy tinkering, but without feeling like I've got this, I'm on the back of a tiger, and if it stops and turns around, it's going to eat me. That's what it felt like when we were really going through the biggest growth phase for Cigar City. Like I said, you don't notice that demarcation line. You don't know it's going to be there, and then you turn around and you go, yeah, this is not what I thought I was going to be doing.
Is that a big reason why you ended up selling?
Huge reason. It's my kids too is a big reason. They were still relatively young. So my oldest now are 16, and then I got a 14 and 11. But it's been, the last 5 years, I've been able to be as present as I want to be in their lives. And it's been very nice.
You can't replace that.
You can't. And I could have, it was a first generation business for me. I certainly, again, I built it around Tampa with all of the trappings of Tampa. So there was certainly that moment where I was like, oh, if I sell this, it kind of loses some of that. But I knew what I would have to do to keep stewarding that business. I was going to have to be stealing a lot from my family and my kids. And I didn't, I would have gotten a big financial reward. And I got one regardless, but I would have been able to steward that and hand it on to them maybe for the next generation. But, my oldest kids are still 16. They're not going to be looking to take over a brewery for another decade.
Right.
So I would have had to take a lot from the relationship I have with them personally to then hand them a business later. And it was a thing. I really did the math on that, and I was like, yeah, I don't want to do what I got to do to keep that business until then.
Your kids will thank you later for that. That is awesome. You recognized that transition. Hey, I'm going to make a huge sacrifice if I keep this up. Do you probably look back though and imagine, man, where could I have taken it? Right. That's a natural part of it.
I do, but I think once I made the decision, it's pretty easy. And I know, I've been in a lot of entrepreneur groups. I've heard a lot of entrepreneurs have sold, and that is a refrain I hear a lot, that people have that regret. Like, I didn't. Once I made my mind up to do it, I looked at it as, hey, that was a thing I did. It's not who I was. And I see things that happen, and I was like, I wouldn't have done that. I would have done it this way. But that said, to make the decision to be able to go and correct what I think they're doing wrong, I would have had to been doing it all the way along. And again, I realized what I was giving up to do that, and everything. That's life, right? You make choices. I identified that if I did that, I would get an outcome that I didn't think was ideal. And so it was very easy for me to just move on.
Yeah. And you can still drink the beer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're still making it here. You can still enjoy it. You still see that label.
Yeah. So they make a lot of it in North Carolina now, but they have a kind of a small brewery here. But they, that's when we sold, they have this huge brewery in Brevard, just outside of Asheville, and it is far more economic for them to make it there. It's, the bulk beer, the highlight, and ship it back in.
Now, like you said, it's a different level of the game. I mean, they probably have to make decisions that you might not have made.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, if I would have kept it, I would have had to borrow a ton of money or not grown. And the problem with not growing in the beer business is the distributor, he's investing every year, he's growing his business. If you go to him and say, Mr. Distributor, I'm not going to grow for the next 5 years, he's going to go, no problem. And then he's going to leave that meeting and go to another brewery that he can grow.
I didn't even
because
think
if you're
about
not growing,
that
you're
aspect.
dying. If you're not growing, you're dying.
Of keeping up with the distributor, that's a relationship I didn't really think
business
about.
Relationship too.
Right.
He if he's doing great with you and you're not growing, and he knows he has an opportunity, why even if he thinks he has a slightly less opportunity from a margin standpoint, but this other brewery he can sell twice as many as what you're doing, he's going to do that. And
purely business.
It is a business thing, and that's another thing. Again, so if I would have kept the brewery, I would have had to borrow a lot of money because I didn't have enough from a cash flow standpoint to just plop in a new brewery and build it. And a lot of people will look at what's happened post transaction and say, oh, that's just horrible corporations. How could they? Because they make cuts to payroll, and they do things to save money. I'm telling you, some of the things they did them way slower than I would have had to, because when you have to make that payment every month, you have to maximize it, because and most of what we did prior, we did with cash flow. I cash flowed it as long as I could. And you just get to a point where I equated having a brewery to like playing blackjack, but it would be like if you went to play blackjack and you won and you went to take your money and the dealer was like, no, not only do you not take your money, you have to match what that bet is. You have to take more money out of your pocket and keep it on the table, and you had to keep letting it ride.
So your growth was like a freaking rocket ship those last few years before the transaction, before you sold.
It was, and like I said, I would have had to. In fact, I did. I got it's Valley Bank now, but I forget the bank before. But they had actually funded me, I think, for like $12 million. It was like the largest. It was the largest loan. This is in like 15. It was the largest loan they had approved to a business up to that point, and I was approved. I could take the money, and I literally went from that going, fuck, and I started running through the math of like, okay, what am I gonna have to pay every month? Okay, well, we do that, but if this happens and this happens and this happens, if this slows down, and it really was like I was doing that, and I was like, and I was getting these offers for the business. I'm like, the business is worth way more to these other people than it is to me when I factor in how poorly I'm going to sleep at night with this debt.
Yeah. I mean, I understand it from that perspective because I'm a real estate guy, right? So when I'm making investments, debt is always a part of the equation. That's just how the business works. When you look at what debt costs today, obviously things were different back then,
Right.
but it's hard to make deals work. I can't imagine having a term sheet in front of you, $15 million, looking at what that debt service would be, and then thinking about the things that could go wrong and then what that nut is if you can't cover it.
Yeah.
Damn.
And the thing, we had a pretty, it was a pretty family kind of business environment. I've had employees, wreck a forklift, drop a pallet of beer. Hey, it's $8,000 loss. No problem. Just, coach them up. This is why it can't happen again. But you start having that happen when you have monthly payments that big.
Oof.
You've got to be a little more ruthless as far as not allowing things like that. And like I said, I didn't notice that line until I'd already crossed it, and I did realize what I would have to become to run a business like that, and I didn't want to.
And you didn't want to do it. And like you said, you didn't want to make that sacrifice with your family. How did that transaction occur? Did you approach them? Did you put it out for sale?
I never put a shingle out. I just had a lot of inbound. The timing was a lot of it. You had craft was in its ascendancy. It's pulled back. It's slowed down a lot now. But there was a lot of strategic buyers. Your Budweisers, your Millers, even out of breweries out of the country were just looking to get into that space, and so I just had people start knocking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And then they kind of wrote you the offer. You thought about it. And
I kind of got several offers from several different people. Ultimately, I ended up selling to a kind of a conglomerate of other craft brewers that were backed by private equity. And that felt better to me than selling to Budweiser or Miller.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But I had the opportunity to sell to Budweiser, and I left a lot of money on the table not to sell to them. But that was, again, another thing, when you already have money, there's basically only a couple things you can do with it. You can buy things you want, or you can buy things you don't want, experiences you don't want to have. And I didn't want to have the experience of selling to Budweiser. So
yeah, and back to that kind of corporate-y conversation, they probably would have taken it down that road and maybe would have turned it into something that you wouldn't have been proud of.
Yeah.
Who's to say what they would have
yeah,
done,
and
right?
again, and it's so Monster ended up buying it, and some people can argue that that's happening now. I like where Cigar City is as far as the quality of the beer. I actually think it's in a really good place. But again, it's not mine anymore, and I have
Right.
to, and I'm way more comfortable with that than I think a lot of people who are fans of the brewery are.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. You made that transition. What's next for you, Joey? What are you thinking? I know you mentioned you still have you said Cigar City Mead and Cider,
Cider and Mead,
Cider
yeah.
and Mead,
Yeah.
and Ybor City.
And we're actually we're about to. So that's been around a long time. We're having our 10th anniversary in November. So it's been a decade that's been around. Which,
I gotta go check it out.
Yeah, that kind of creeped up on me.
Yeah, yeah. So that is a restaurant component too.
So there is food there, but I don't run it. It's King of the Coop, which is a Nashville hot chicken place. Joe Dodd has a location in there. So there is food. You can have King of the Coop, which is I think the best Nashville hot chicken in Tampa. But I don't do the food myself. I don't control it. I just basically created the space for him to be there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like adding a food component kind of takes the business into a different space. Was that ever a consideration for you along the way? Did you want to add a restaurant component?
Well, we actually ended up doing a brew pub in Carewood,
Right.
and it was there for a few years. For me, it was a big distraction from the core business because I was still actively running that. And I had a lot of help with it, but it's still just. Restaurants are hard. They are hard. They're just another level. And I think the toughest thing about restaurants is everyone feels like they know that space really well, whether they've worked in it or not, because they've been to restaurants, and it's just the satisfaction is just so much harder to get across the board in that space.
It's so true.
And the margins are terrible. I don't know why anyone runs a restaurant. I really don't. The margins are terrible, and it's so hard to satisfy anyone.
Well, you look at those guys like Jeff Gigante here locally,
Yeah.
or like the Chichio Group, and we have some awesome operators here locally that do a really good job. And yeah, God, you go in some of those restaurants, Meat Market, Boulogne, some of those larger establishments that have the cocktails and the full service restaurant. They're open all day, and you go, how the hell is this all possible? You know, the amount of dedication it takes to ordering the right, you know, how do you judge how many steaks you're going to sell? You can't just freeze them all, right?
Right. Well,
And
well,
use
if
them,
you do, your quality
your
decreases.
quality
Yeah.
drops and then you go out of
Right.
business. It's like there's so many things that could screw up along the way in a restaurant. It's amazing that those guys, all those different groups, have been able to do what they can do. I mean, even Bloomin' Brands here in Tampa, Outback Steakhouse, look what that turned into.
Yeah.
Hooters over here in Clearwater, look what that turned into. Kudos to those dudes. But yeah, I can't really imagine a more difficult industry. And for me as a customer, right, like a lot of people have that expectation when they go to a brewery or they go to some place that serves alcohol. Why don't they serve food? Where's the food? Man, it's not like you guys can just add food to a bar. It is like adding an entirely new business.
Yeah, like I said, the margins they're really not good.
Yeah.
It's you do a lot of work, and if you're excellent, on every dollar you make, maybe 20 cents. If you're lucky.
Jeez. Yeah, and then the liability and everything
Yeah.
else that goes into it. And I guess, I mean, the good thing is you could say, hey, the food brings people in.
Yeah, that's it's one
Part
of
of
the
the
reasons.
equation.
It's and again too, I think it does depend on the type of food you're doing, but it's a tough space just because there's so many people doing it. It's it's a saturated space. There's tons of different restaurant options. It's just tough. But yeah, food, it definitely helps. But I don't want to be the one running it.
You'd rather just enjoy it.
Yeah.
I hear you there. Me too. On the Encore development, I wanted to talk to you about that. When Encore was first developed, it was, I think, part of bad timing. It was kind of recession era. They took a little bit longer to get kicked off. It feels like a decade or so, 2011, 12, 13, 14, through those years. And then only recently there's this big resurgence. There's a couple new buildings that are going up over there. There's a hotel component. What are you working on over there?
So right at the corner of Cass and Governor Street. So Governor runs right through the Encore development. A couple years back, there was like it used to be just not a supermarket, a convenience store, and the building was for sale. I thought it was priced a little high, but I don't know, something about it. Me and my wife, we were enamored with it. We ended up buying it, and then we honestly, my plan was just to white box it and put a for lease sign up. And in the interim, some guys that I'd known that had actually worked for me at Cigar City Brewing that had moved on to other breweries, Coppertail and Angry Chair Brewing, had approached me, and they had a brewery that was in the Poorhouse in Channelside, and so not very far from there. And they were like, hey, we're looking to do something, and it just kind of grew out of that. And so we've been building it out probably a little over a year now. But the building's come along really nice. Those guys, they hired, it was called Create and Company, interior design, and they just did a fantastic job. It's a really cool looking space.
So yeah, let's pull this up. So Encore is kind of right there in the center of that large new development, which is such a big portion of our urban core, and it's smack dab in the middle. You guys are in a great spot.
Yeah, it's a nice segue from Ybor into downtown.
100%. And it'll tie in with Gasworks and the new development up there transitioning into the central business district.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt the location's killer. So where was the building you bought?
So right there at the corner of Cass and Governor.
Governor's this street that goes north-south.
That building right there.
Got it. So you just, something spoke to you there and you're like, hey, let's buy this thing. So it's probably
That's it right
there.
there.
It's a cool, what was it? You said
It was a convenience store. It was called Chris and Pamela's.
even before that, it almost looks like maybe an auto body
It was
shop.
an auto body. It was an auto. I think I was actually a mechanic before. I'm pretty sure it was a mechanic.
It's an old building too. I mean, that
Yeah,
thing's-
we loved the design of it. It had that kind of like slight Art Deco kind of 50s look to it.
What's kind of a shame is if you were to buy that raw land and want to build a building that looked exactly like that, there's so many more roadblocks today.
Yeah.
And the parking requirements, and we talked a little bit about all the permitting and the building codes and
And you're
electrical.
in the downtown district, so there's other layers that you have to adhere to. There's a whole landscaping review that had to happen. There was a lot more than it's naivety is what drives, I think, any small business. Because if you knew what you were getting into, no one would do anything.
No one would do it. Everything would just be in the idea world, right?
Yeah.
Nothing would actually come to fruition. That's really exciting.
But yeah, so on the lot just past Harrison, they're probably 4 floors up on building that, and then where the hotel is going, where that lot is on Cass Street, right there.
Right here.
Yep. So that's where the hotel is going to be, and I hear it's 180 key hotel plus some residential, plus retail, and then Dr. Patel in that middle lot there.
Yep.
That's going to be like a grocery store and 40,000 square foot medical plus residential.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I believe one of those projects just got a construction loan.
Yeah, that was the Patel one.
The Patel one.
Yeah.
So that'll happen, right?
Yep. And then they're building a bunch of townhomes back past Scott Street. They're almost done. Yeah. Those are almost done.
Site development.
They actually look really cool. I've walked by it several times.
Well, they built them to make them look, authentic to Ybor, right? I believe they're brick all the way up, or made to look like that. They kind of have a Ybor City feel, but it's a little more contemporary. It's a really great design. This whole stop like kind of right there, Tyler, and go south a little bit. Scroll down. Yeah, like if you look at Tampa's urban core, I think. Like you and I grew up here, right? I think we kind of always thought of downtown as this little pocket on the bottom left. But now with all the development happening, you can kind of get this macro picture of really what's to come here in the next few decades. You've got Ybor and Channelside Gasworks. Daryl Shaw is doing Ybor Harbor, which is all the way up the Ybor Channel. And then you have a ton of development on the left side of the map in Tampa Heights. So you can, and then of course Encore and the smack dab in the middle of it all. You've got this big picture of what's to come, and it's so exciting because man, we have a large downtown area to work with.
Yeah,
this is a huge area, and if we develop it the right way and it's walkable and we have adequate transportation, man, we are going to be at the forefront of the new American downtown.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons the guys at Late Start, they decided they were going to incorporate coffee, and one of the reasons they did is they realized hey, we're basically in downtown, but we're also sort of people that are commuting in, coming from Seminole Heights or Ybor, they're going right by us in the morning and coming by in the evening. Right. So that's where they got the idea to do a coffee component as well, and they are doing food because they're again it's the gateway into downtown if you're coming from anywhere Ybor, Seminole Heights north.
All of East Tampa, that's how they go. They go down Nucio and Nebraska and then, of course, all of those people staying at that hotel, boom, there you are right there downstairs. That's a really cool strategic piece you picked up. What year did you buy that property?
I think we bought it, let's see, it's probably 2 years ago. So probably around 22.
Yeah, you probably did really well on that. It's kind of, we're in such a tight market right now. It's hard to make things work. It's a little frustrating for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other real estate guys, but I think Tampa has an opportunity with some of these old warehouses. And Ybor, and then up near the airport, there's some cool properties with a little vision and a little capital could be turned into something special.
Yeah, I do think you identified sort of some of the permitting things could be a challenge, but most of the development is big development. But I like seeing the kind of smaller things that are rehabbed instead of just knocked down, and then we put together a city block and build a 20 story. I'd like to see some more sort of rehabbing, but I think the city needs to look at how they can encourage that.
And some of the developers of those larger projects that we've had on the show, or ones that I've talked to, say the same thing. Like they want those smaller infill developers to come in and add to whatever neighborhood they're building in.
Yeah, because a big development, sure, you throw a lot of doors in there residentially, but people need stuff to do. And yes, we've built a pretty good amount of options, but the more you build, the more doors you build, the more residences you build, the more places and things you need to have for people to do. And that's one of the reasons I love that spot is, I live on Harbor Island and I can walk all the way up the road along Channel Side there because there's a path offset, so I don't have to be in the road.
Yeah.
And I can get there pretty easy. And then you've got the green spine, the bike that runs all the way down Casa Nuccio. But there hasn't traditionally been a lot of to do over there. It's all been obviously more towards Water Street and downtown
for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of awesome how things are changing, like we've said. But yeah, for the longest time, there was really nothing to walk to. I know you're a big walker. You said you live on Harbor Island. How has that shifted in the last few years? And why do you like walking? Like, what about it? Do you enjoy?
So first, what I like about walking, I mean, obviously it's decent exercise, and it helps me kind of stave off some of the worst effects of all the beer I like to drink.
Yeah.
But it clears my head too. It's almost therapy and exercise at the same time because it just I get out there and walk and it kind of clears my head. It allows me to think on things and. I love walking obviously on Bayshore and I got the pull-up bars and you can, they've got all of the calisthenics things you can do. But as far as how I've seen Water Street change, so I moved to Harbor Island. I used to live in Beach Park and I moved like right as COVID was hitting. I mean, it was actually COVID was full going. And so, Water Street was still under construction. Really nothing had been open yet. I got to see there was a little bit of that sort of lived in city feel because you still, once COVID went away, you still had the convention center and there was some bustle, but man, post Water Street with all that's moved in, it feels like being in an actual city now,
Yeah,
but in a really chill way. Like, it's like there's tons of activity. There's people walking around, going to work, going to lunch, just out living their lives. And there's real volume of people. You actually, it feels like you're in a little corner of Manhattan or Chicago and Tampa's never felt that way.
No.
But it feels it in a very and it's still in a very cool Florida way because you got all this water around you.
Right, yeah.
I have to walk over a bridge to get back into downtown, and then if you walk along, you walk along the Riverwalk, man, it's it still feels very Tampa and tropical, but it feels like a real city too.
It totally. We were trying to think of the name of the condo I used to live in, Park Crest.
Okay.
So across from AMSO, I used to walk from there. Down the waterfront, over the bridge, through Water Street to Crunch every day.
Yeah.
That was kind of my routine. This was kind of back in that era too, 2020, 2021. And man, it made my days feel better. It made my days feel better to be in the sun and the fresh air, and you could see the people. And from someone who was in a workout outfit going to a gym like I was, or if it was someone commuting in a suit, it was really, really cool to see people all engaged in an economy and in a society. And I think that's something our cities have lost over the years. And when you're in your car and you're in traffic, you start your day out with a really horrible sense of the world. You're frustrated, it's busy, you're on a time constraint. Whereas when you walk to work, you have a completely different experience.
Yeah. You're literally siloed in a car. You're encased in your own little world.
Your own little music and your own little climate control, which is probably better this time of year in Florida.
It's funny, because I do walk so much and I drive so little now, but if I have to drive 15 minutes, I would rather walk 35 minutes because I find it so much more relaxing than drive for 10 or 15 minutes.
The perspective is even different too. I actually did an hour walk this morning, 30 minutes out, 30 back. I live down near the air base, so I kind of went up Bayshore, South of Gandhi, which was awesome. And you notice things you never noticed before. You experience the world very differently. You see the city in a different way. And I think that is so cool. And I've lived down there for a couple months. I've driven that road, 100 times. And I saw things today that I really appreciated. And I think if more people started their morning or walked in general, they could appreciate where they live.
So year to date, we're halfway through the year. That's how many miles I average per day walking.
Bro. 9.34 people. 9.34.
My goal is 10, so I'm actually lagging.
I have people in my family and other people that are in their late 80s that stay active and walk, that is the absolute key to longevity.
I really
in
think
life.
you keep moving. I really do believe that is the key to living a long life, is keep moving.
Physically and mentally, be working on something you're passionate about and keep it moving.
I used to skateboard a lot, and there was like a skateboard saying, I'm sure lots of sports say it, but I heard it first in skateboarding. It's like, you didn't get too old to skateboard. You got old because you stopped skateboarding.
Right, man. Yeah, Tony Hawk's still out there crushing
He
it.
is.
That dude's awesome. Well, listen, Joey, this was great. I appreciate you being here. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Where can people find you? You do social and
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Don't check it as much, but I'm on Instagram, and I'm probably just under Joey. I forget what I think. I think I'm Joey Redner. CCB
Joey Redner
on Instagram.
Search it; they'll be able to find you. Awesome.
Yeah, I've never
Joey,
been hard to find.
Yeah, Joey, thanks again. I
thank you
appreciate
for having me.
All right,
Cheers.
see you next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you guys for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like it. Check us out on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. Give us a comment. Give us some feedback. We want to know how we're doing. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.